Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to this very special edition of the Know and Love series of events that we have. We have two very distinguished speakers, and on behalf of the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago, it's really an honor to welcome both of them, David Foster and Vicci Rodgers. They are going to present share their insights on the history of the Methodist movement in Chicago. So we are looking forward to their wonderful presentation. And as a way of introduction, David Foster is a historian of the First United Methodist Church of Chicago, which also is known as the Chicago Temple. He authored the book, Sermon in Stone, the Story of the Chicago Temple, and he has also chaired the Historian Task Force at the First United Methodist Church of Chicago for its recent centennial. David joined Irving Park Methodist Church in 1984 and served as the leader, which is actually this space, the Irving Park Methodist Church. So here he has served as a leader until 2019. That's when the Vivekananda Vedanta Society had purchased this space. For many years, he was the curator of the geography research collection at Encyclopedia Britannica. And welcoming Vicci Rodgers. She has been a lifelong Methodist and has been an active member of Irving Park United Methodist Church, which is now called the Renewed Hope United Methodist Church. She's an entrepreneur and has served on the board of directors for the Irving Park Community Food Pantry for many years, and for decades has been active in AFS intercultural programs focused on high school student exchange and promoting world peace. So please join me in welcoming both of our distinguished speakers with a round of applause. And so we will be having a question and answer session after the presentation, so have your questions ready. And on that note, I request David to start his presentation.
Thank you so very much. It's an honor to be invited here by the Vivekananda Vedanta Society, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Vicci and I have a lot of history in this building, as you will hear today during this presentation, but it's been a beautiful experience to walk around and see the facility now as it's being used, and it's actually very heartwarming, and I just want to say thank you. This is a beautiful invitation and a beautiful opportunity as well. Well, as I get started, let me just say, I am not a professional historian. I hope folks understand that. I've spent most of my life as a United Methodist, and I have actually worked for the United Methodist Church. You may remember I spent many years working for the General Board of Pension and Health Benefits of the United Methodist Church. And I was very deeply involved in the historical research work at the Chicago Temple, or more correctly, the First United Methodist Church of Chicago, as we were preparing to celebrate our centennial as a building just last year. So I'll say a few words about that a little farther into the presentation. So before we actually jump into the discussion, I want to say that my plan is to say a few words about the beginnings or the origins of Methodism or the Methodist movement. It may be familiar to some of you, but maybe not to others. So I'd like to say a few words about that. I would like to say a few words about how the church actually started here in what we now know as the United States. That's an interesting story in its own right. So I'd like to say a few words about that. And then I do want to finish by talking about how Methodism developed in Chicago, or more specifically, how the congregation we now know of as the Chicago Temple represented the growth of Methodism in Chicago in the 1800s and early 1900s. So that's the plan for today. Let me say one last thing about the words we use here. Those of us who have grown up in a Methodist church may say, oh, we go to the Methodist church, or we may say we go to the United Methodist Church. We may say a number of things, and it's not always clear what each word really means. Methodism, of course, is a broad term, and I use that to describe the movement that was begun by John Wesley in the 18th century. The church I am a part of, and that this particular congregation represented many years ago, is a part of the United Methodist Church. But there are other Methodist churches around the world. In the United States, the United Methodist Church is the oldest and largest Methodist denomination here, but there are other Methodist churches. So if I refer to the Methodist Church, I'm probably really referring to the United Methodist Church, but it's very common for folks to simplify and simply say, I belong to the Methodist Church. But it technically is the United Methodist Church, so just so you know. Okay, I'd like to begin with just a word or two about John Wesley. John Wesley, as you probably know, was an 18th century clergy person of the Church of England. And I think it is safe to say that probably every Methodist church anywhere in the world traces its origins to John Wesley. The Methodist movement began in earnest, I would say, in the year 1738, when John Wesley embarked on let's call it an itinerant preaching mission throughout the British Isles, mostly England, but he started a big revival movement within the Church of England. So it's important to know John Wesley was an ordained clergy person, and a typical ordained clergy person would have served an individual church, just as this was once an individual church. And we had a pastor who preached every Sunday, who baptized folks, married folks, buried folks, visited the sick in the hospital, and so on. Well, John Wesley might have done that if he had been a parish priest, as they would have said in England in those days. But he wasn't comfortable doing that. He felt that the Church of England had actually not reached everybody very well, and so he literally took to the streets to spread the message of the gospel. Don't think of him as a street preacher as we might think of one today, but he really was out of the ordinary in his time. He went to coal mines and he preached to coal miners. He went to prisons and he preached to prisoners. And his whole point was to try to bring the gospel message to those places where he thought the gospel message had not really been preached very well. Well, his efforts were very successful. Most places where he preached, people came to him in droves, listened to his preaching, and were converted, if you want to use that word, to Wesley's style of the Church of England. It wasn't Methodism really in those days, but it was the message that Wesley was giving as a part of the Church of England's ministry to folks. So from the beginning of his preaching, he was organizing folks into societies. These were people who were touched by his preaching, and he wanted to organize them. He didn't feel that it was fair to preach a sermon to folks and then walk away and leave them to their own devices. He organized, and he wanted to make sure that he kept his eye on all of the folks who were coming to hear him preach. So a number of societies were created, basically Methodist societies, as we would call them today. And these societies became the bedrock of the Methodist movement. Wesley's own preaching pretty much followed a triangle in England, from London to Bristol to Newcastle and back. And throughout that triangle, he would create these societies, and he would call the folks who belonged to them the people called Methodist. Now, Wesley's whole point was not to start a new church. Don't most reformers say that? They have no intention of starting a new church. Well, Wesley would never call himself a reformer, but he would have called himself someone who was interested in reviving the faith as he knew it in the Church of England. And he expected the members of his societies to remain faithful members of the Church of England. And to his death, John Wesley was a member of the Church of England. Now, a lot of members of the Church of England might not say he was as faithful to it as maybe he himself thought he was, but nonetheless, he went to his death as a member of the Church of England. But his followers over the years drifted apart from the Church of England, and so we'll have to talk a few minutes about how the Methodist Church, as we know it today, was actually organized pretty much after Wesley's death. But Wesley's work wasn't directed to some kind of new theology. He wasn't starting a new faith. He wasn't preaching a new theological point of view. His whole point was to, and these are his words, spread scriptural holiness across the land. That was Wesley's own phrase, what he was doing. Well, scriptural holiness, that's a big phrase. I'm not quite sure exactly what Wesley always meant by that, but that was his point, to spread scriptural holiness throughout the land. This ministry began, as I said, in the year 1738 and continued until Wesley's death in 1741. Now, 1791, forgive me, 1791. And let's just say a word about Charles Wesley. Charles Wesley, John Wesley's brother, also an ordained clergy person of the Church of England. And Charles was very active with John in the Methodist revival movement. They really worked together. Folks may not know they know John Wesley, but if you have worshiped in a Christian church of almost any denomination, you probably know Charles Wesley, because Charles Wesley wrote some very famous hymns that Christians around the world, or at least the English-speaking world, still sing today. And just in a month, at Christmas time, you'll hear perhaps one of the most famous, "Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King." This is a Charles Wesley hymn, one of his many, many famous and well-known hymns sung by many congregations and not just Methodist congregations. So we really need to give Charles Wesley his due in the Methodist movement. He was very active with his brother Charles in the revival movement. I'm sorry. Oh yes, they're brothers. They are brothers. The Wesley family was quite large. John and Charles were brothers, and there were, I believe, a total of 19 children, many of whom did not survive into adulthood. But they were from a very big family. Their father was also a clergy person in the Church of England, and their mother, Susanna, very famous, was also deeply religious, and apparently the kids, John and Charles especially, learned a lot about their Christian faith from their mother, Susanna, not so much perhaps from their father, who was the parish priest there in Epworth where they grew up. But yes, John and Charles were brothers for sure. Thank you for that question. Absolutely. Okay, now I'd like to move to this next slide. So, we've already talked about societies. Wesley founded religious societies, and he called them societies on purpose because they weren't separate from the Church of England. Today, we would call a society a congregation, probably. But in Wesley's time, he was very careful not to do that. In fact, he expected the members of his society to worship in their parish church, their Church of England parish church, to take communion every week, to hear the sermon there. And so Methodist meetings always took place, say, 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, so everybody could go to the parish church at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and that was very much Wesley's expectation. But what did Wesley himself call one of these societies? I like this quotation: "A company of men," okay, men and women, "having the form and seeking the power of godliness, united in order to pray together, to receive the word of exhortation, and to watch over one another in love, that they may help each other to work out their salvation." Again, not a lot of theology here, just how we react and treat each other as fellow Christians in our own pilgrimages on our life of faith. So that's Wesley's own definition of the Methodist Society. Now, he also said this about the people who belong to the society. A Methodist is one who has the love of God shed abroad in his heart by the Holy Ghost given unto him. God is the joy of his heart and the desire of his soul. So, all of you who are Methodists, there you are. Do you see yourself there? This was Wesley's own definition of who is a Methodist. Now, let's just take a look at this, because this is also a little fun, but it's very serious. Wesley had expectations for the members of these societies. He expected the folks who responded to his preaching to behave in a certain way, that they would turn their lives around in a certain way, and that they would do no harm, and then they would do good, and then they would attend upon all the ordinances of God. Let's look at the last one, because that's the easiest one to talk about. What does it mean to attend upon all the ordinances of God? Well, Wesley expected everybody to go to church on Sunday, listen to the sermon, take communion, go to church. He expected people to pray, not just on Sunday, but during the week. He expected people to fast. Frequently, in fact. Wesley was a firm believer in the power of fasting and abstinence. So that's what Wesley meant when he talked about attending upon all the ordinances of God. Now, the first two, we might chuckle. Do no harm. Wesley had a lot of things about, well, what does that mean? Well, don't use profanity. Don't drink excessively. Don't work on the Sabbath. He had a lot of these rules for what it means to do no harm. Do good is a little easier for us to understand. Wesley was very clear that he expected the Methodists to be active members of the communities in which they lived. He expected them to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to visit folks in prison. He really expected Methodists to be very active in the communities in which they lived by doing good to the folks there who needed particular help. So that's a fairly easy one to talk about. So the last quotation we'll look at by Wesley, I've added because I think this is one of his more famous quotations. And let's just look at this for a minute. But as to all opinions which do not strike at the root of Christianity, we think and let think. This is a very famous Wesley quotation, and I suppose it can be misquoted in many ways. But Wesley is pretty much saying, I'm not here to argue with you over fine points of theology or doctrine. Wesley certainly had some bedrock ideas that he held and expected his followers to hold. But he said, beyond that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We think and we let think. So Wesley was really somewhat ahead of his time, I think. I don't want you to think of him as just a real liberal Christian. If he walked in today, we might think he was really pretty conservative. But nonetheless, for his time, he was making a very strong statement here. Okay, we can agree on some very elemental or fundamental ideas about Christianity, but after that, if we don't agree, it doesn't matter. We can still love one another and work on our spiritual lives together. And that was very much a part of Methodism. Okay, now, let's just say one last thing about the organization of Methodism or Methodist churches. I think it's important to say this. Those of you who have familiarity with the Methodist Church will know what all of this is. All of this goes back to John Wesley himself. John Wesley considered all of these societies that he founded in England to be in connection with him. He really operated as like the parent of each of these societies. He expected to really, that they would look up to him as the father figure in the society. But Wesley used the word connection. They are in connection with me. And we continue to use the name today in Methodism to describe how our various churches are connected with one another, our various conferences, and I'll get to conference in just a minute, how our conferences are connected, how our church boards and agencies are connected. We're all connected as Methodists. And it really goes back to John Wesley, who considered all of the members of his society connected to him. Itineracy, this is an important word. It may not be familiar to you, but John Wesley appointed lay preachers to oversee these societies that he had created in England. And he controlled where they went. And he might tell one lay preacher, okay, this week I want you here, but next week you're going to go here. And, well, that's what happened. John Wesley really controlled that. He felt that a pastor or a preacher didn't really need to be in any one place too long. So he very much practiced itineracy, and we continue to do that in our church today. Methodist pastors are appointed by church leaders, and they may move with some frequency. They don't have a choice of where they go. They are appointed where they are needed. That's the theory. They're appointed where they are needed, and then they're moved when they are needed somewhere else. Now, you might ask, what does that mean, needed somewhere else? Well, we'll let the bishop and the district superintendents explain it to us someday. But anyway, that's the idea, that a Methodist pastor goes where he or she is needed. That's the important way to look at itineracy. And then the last thing is conference. Wesley would bring his lay preachers together once or twice a year. They'd have a big meeting and they'd talk about, well, how well is the revival movement going? What are the problems? Let's talk about all of that. And then this conference would make some decisions. Well, okay, let's try a different approach this way or this way. So the conference became very, very important in the growth of Methodism. And to this day, in the United Methodist Church especially, the conference is the center of control in the church. A local church has a charge conference. The entire church has a general conference. The annual conference meets every year. And each conference has certain authority that it alone has and no one else has. So the conference continues to operate today just really as Wesley started it himself back in the 18th century. So it's a very essential part of the Methodist story, the conferences. Those of you who are familiar with the United Methodist Church may have a variety of opinions about the various conferences that we hold in the church, but the conferences remain the very important way that the church governs itself at very many different levels. Okay, now, I'd like to then jump to, let's start with the United States, Methodism in the United States. And we're going to look at, not something in Chicago, but the John Street United Methodist Church in New York City. This church still exists. If you're ever in New York, do visit. It's a great place to visit. It's really in the Wall Street area. This is the oldest Methodist religious building in the United States. Now, I say oldest building. The particular picture you see here is not the oldest. This is from the middle part of the 1800s. But it replaced the first Methodist building in the United States, which dated from the year 1768. Let's say 1768. So it really gets the credit as being the first Methodist building or church in what would become the United States. And that's the key here. 1768, remember, when was the Declaration of Independence? 1776. The American Revolution didn't come to an end until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So we were still very much an English colony or a series of colonies when that building was established in 1768. But think about it for a minute. Methodists were, whether they liked it or not, were connected with the Church of England. The Church of England is a national church. And who is the head of the Church of England? Well, the monarch. Right now, it's Charles III, who is the head of the English church. And during these days, when this church was built, it was the infamous George III who was the head of the English church. So, as the revolution took place, the American Revolution, people connected with the Church of England and the King of England were considered dangerous, traitors, Tories, whatever. And many of the Anglican priests in the United States went undercover. Many of them went to Canada, many of them went back to England. And so Methodists, who were supposed to get the sacraments at their local Church of England, didn't have a place to go anymore to receive sacraments. Many Methodist pastors also went undercover, and some left the United States, or what would become the United States as well. So Mr. Wesley thought this is a real problem. The Methodists in America need sacraments. How is he going to fill the void when there were no operating Church of England parishes in the United States? So in the year 1784, Wesley took a very extraordinary step for which he received a great deal of criticism. He ordained a couple of lay people. He was just a clergyman himself. He really didn't have the authority in the Church of England to ordain anybody. Bishops ordained clergy persons, not other clergy persons. But Wesley said the situation demands radical action. So I'm going to ordain a couple of people. And he sent them to the United States and said, okay, you can start a church in the United States and begin giving the sacraments and so on. And so that's what happened. These guys, if I may call them that, came to the United States in 1784, towards the end of the year, and at a very famous conference, the Christmas Conference, as it's called, met in Baltimore in 1784. All of the lay preachers who were still around within the Methodist connection came to this conference, and they created the church we belong to today. We call it today the United Methodist Church, but in 1784, its name was the Methodist Episcopal Church. And it was the Methodist Episcopal Church until the year 1939. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the truth is, the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States is older than the Methodist Church in Great Britain. That might sound strange because Methodism began in Great Britain. But because Wesley was still alive and did not want to break with the Church of England, all of his followers in England were still technically Anglicans until Wesley died. And then both Anglicans and Methodists pretty much parted company. And the church in England was formed after Wesley's death. So our church in the United States really claims to be the oldest Methodist church in the world, independent Methodist church in the world, having been organized in the year 1784. Okay, so that's a lot about history. So let's just jump ahead here to Methodism here in Illinois and Chicago. You see a couple of slides here, the Chicago Temple. The Chicago Temple is technically not the name of the church, but we all call it the Chicago Temple, so I hope that's okay with everybody. But it's really the first Methodist Episcopal Church of Chicago. And you'll notice that the first building of that church dates to 1834. The church itself was organized in the year 1831. So it's going to be 200 years old in a few years, the church downtown. In 1845, the church built a more conventional-looking church building, and then in the 1920s built the Chicago Temple. The building you see in that graphic, in that illustration, though, is not the way the Chicago Temple was actually built. It doesn't really look like that. But anyway, that was an early design for it. Before we look more closely at the Methodist Church here in Chicago, I would like to say that the first Methodist church in the state of Illinois dates to 1805. Illinois wasn't even a state in 1805. But the first church dates to 1805, and that's in southern Illinois, near the city of Edwardsville. You may know where Edwardsville is. It's today would be considered a suburb of St. Louis. But anyway, it was a part of the Southern Illinois Conference of the Methodist Church. But in 1805, that's where the first Methodist building in the state of Illinois was built. And then in 1828, some of you may know McKendree College. 1828, McKendree College was founded. It was really founded not as a college, but it became a college very soon. It's the oldest Methodist institution of higher learning in the United States. Now, there's a school in Kentucky that claims it is the oldest. So let's just say it's one of the oldest institutions of higher learning in the United States. 1828, McKendree College, also in southern Illinois, Lebanon, Illinois, in southern Illinois. But let's go back to our first church downtown because we've got a lot to say about that. So, I don't know if you can see this picture very well. I'm going to turn on the laser here. You might ask, well, third church building, where is the church? Where is the church in this picture? Does this work? Okay, it is right. Do you see this here? First Methodist Church. There it is. Well, you might say that doesn't look like a church. That looks like an office building. Well, it is an office building. Look at the year, 1858. Church leaders decided that, we're downtown Chicago. There's a lot of business activity. Why don't we put up an office building, keep a couple floors for ourselves and rent the rest? And when we have profits from the rentals, we can turn those profits around to other Methodist churches. Great idea. So that's what they did. They built this third church building in 1858, and it's very much an office building. Well, those of you who know your Chicago history will know that in 1871, this building burned to the ground in the Great Chicago Fire. And so church leaders, a year after the fire, 1872, built this building, the fourth church building, built in 1872. It lasted 50 years until 1922. Now, just take a look at, if I can get my laser here, you see this tall building just east of the Methodist church building here? This is the church building. Might look a little more churchy than the first office building, but anyway, it's still an office building. But you notice this building right next to it. It's the old Chicago Title and Trust building. And my gosh, doesn't that look pretty tall next to the 4-story First Methodist Church building? Well, church leaders thought the same. And they thought, oh my gosh, if we're going to try to rent space to private businesses in downtown Chicago, we're going to have a bigger building than this 4-story building. So church leaders spent the next 30 years trying to figure out how to build a bigger building. Well, they succeeded, and this is the result right here. But we'll come back to this in just a minute. I want to go back to this slide. So if you take the first building that we looked at, the third building, and then this building, these two buildings were the center of a huge amount of Methodist activity in the 1800s. And I want to mention some of those activities to you because you'll know some of it yourself. But they were a very expansive group of people in those days. And many denominations did this. Methodists were not alone, but they were interested in health, they were interested in education, interested in a lot of things, and very successfully created schools, hospitals, and so on. And so we're going to talk about some of those things right now, and let's just jump ahead to the next slide. Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. This is still an active theological seminary of the United Methodist Church located in Evanston. Members of the First Methodist Church of downtown Chicago, the church we now call the Chicago Temple, were instrumental in founding Garrett in the year 1851, or 1852, the early 1850s. Mrs. Garrett left almost all of her estate to endow the seminary. And it was really created by members of the First Church downtown. And it's still a very active theological seminary in the United States, but certainly here in our area as well. Now, what other famous school did these same church members create? I don't have a picture of it, but you know it very well. Northwestern University. It began life as a Methodist institution and was Methodist well into the 20th century. I don't know the exact year that church and university went separate ways. And honestly, they aren't totally separate today because the Garrett building is on the Northwestern campus. Northwestern provides the land on which the Garrett building resides. So there is still some connection between Garrett and Northwestern, but the church no longer controls any part of Northwestern University. But members of the church downtown helped to found Northwestern in the early 1850s. Methodists founded big schools that would become big universities all over the United States. You know, Boston University in Boston, the University of Southern California, what's the school in Texas? Perkins School of Theology and Southern Methodist, yes, thank you, Southern Methodist University. Vanderbilt in Nashville started as a Methodist school. It's not now, but it started as one. Many Methodist institutions around the country. Okay, Wesley Memorial Hospital, some of you may actually remember this. The hospital was organized in the year 1888, and in 1941 moved into this dramatic building at the corner of Fairbanks and Superior Street. This, by the way, was designed by an architect who was a member of the downtown Methodist Church. It's now no longer in existence, but it is a part of the Northwestern Medical Complex now. It was merged into the Northwestern Memorial Hospital. So it exists in a way, but the physical building, of course, no longer exists and hasn't for probably 30 years or so. But this building some of you may remember this building. It survived into the very early years of the 1990s, I think. Now, another picture I don't have, the Chicago Training School, which began as a school to train women, deaconesses, as they were known in the 1800s, and it grew to include more than just women, but it was a very big educational institution for women in the United States, in Chicago, also founded by members of the church downtown. By the 1930s, it had merged with the Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, so I don't have a picture of it. And the other thing other building I don't have a picture of is the Lake Bluff Orphanage. These same people from the church downtown in the 1880s started an orphanage all the way north in Lake Bluff. And even though the orphanage itself no longer exists, the successor agency, if I may call it that, still exists, and you will know it as Kids Above All. For many years it was known as Child Serve, but it's really a children's advocacy organization. It's no longer an orphanage, but it still exists, and very, very active in our area. Okay, now the thing I can't say much about, but I would like to simply mention, there was one other very big issue Methodists were involved in Chicago, but around the country as well, and you may know it well, temperance, of course. When I was growing up, temperance was still a very important thing in the Methodist Church. You were really encouraged to keep away from alcoholic beverages when I was growing up. Today, you don't see much of that. At least I don't see too much of it in the church I go to. But temperance was a huge movement in the United States in the second half of the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. And you remember the result, of course, Prohibition, 1920, the Volstead Act. And for the next 13 years, liquor was basically outlawed in the United States. But Methodists were very deeply involved in the temperance movement, and perhaps the most famous Methodist of all was none other than Frances Willard, who was in this area. She was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. But she was really more than that. She was very much involved in women's issues of many kinds, most especially suffrage, the right for women to vote. She was so important that when the state of Illinois submitted its 2 statues to Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol, one of those statues is of Frances Willard. She was that important in her time. Maybe folks don't know her so well today. She lived in Evanston, and there is a home that you can visit in Evanston, the Frances Willard home. There's a museum there, but also a very active Methodist and it reminds us that Methodism was very much involved in the temperance movement in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Okay, now let me just say something about the temple again. I am a member here, so I can talk about this more than I should, but this is our Chicago Temple building as it looks today. This particular photograph dates back to many, many years ago, the 1920s, in fact. And what I want to show here is this building here. You know, if we go back to, here's that very same building. Gee, it dwarfs the 4-story Methodist building. But today, when we look at this picture, notice how the temple dwarfs this building. Anyway, it was this building that really gave the church the impetus to build this great big skyscraper. And the important thing to know is that in 1924, when this building opened, it was the tallest building in Chicago, the tallest building in Chicago. It's pretty amazing. And you can see the distinctive tower and spire on the top of the building. Church leaders wanted that tower and spire on the building because they didn't want people to think it was just an office building. They wanted people to think, oh wow, this must also be a church, which it is. So they said that in a very big way with that huge tower. And since it was the tallest building in Chicago, everybody saw it. You couldn't miss it. Now today, every building is taller than the temple. So you're very hard-pressed to see the tower and steeple today. But in the 20s, when the building opened, absolutely, it cast a very big shadow in downtown Chicago. Here's another view of the tower and spire. Looking towards the northeast, you'll see some other famous buildings. You might notice the Wrigley Tower here, the Tribune Tower there. This is the old Jewelers building, you may notice that. And this photograph dates from the 1950s. And now this is a more contemporary view. You have to be traveling south on Clark Street to see this view of the temple. And that's really about the only street from which you'll see the entire building, from the base to the spire. But there we are. Okay, now, I'm going to just quickly conclude my comments here because I've talked too long and Vicci has some important things to say about this particular building we're in right now. But just last year, the temple building celebrated its 100th anniversary. And we had this beautiful logo. Vicci was very instrumental in helping the temple come up with this logo. And we had a big celebration last September to remember our 100th anniversary as a building. And this gives you a picture of the inside of the church. If you've never been inside, you can see some pretty impressive stained glass windows. You can see a pretty impressive roof on the top of the sanctuary. This is, it's a bit skewed here from this vantage point, but it does give you a sense of what the sanctuary looks like. And then we have a chapel at the very top of the building, right in the tower, at the very top. In fact, this is the tallest place, the highest, let me put it that way, the highest place of worship in the world. It's quite a claim, but apparently it's true. We are in the Guinness Book of World Records as having the highest place of worship in the world. And there it is, right there, the Sky Chapel, 400 feet above street level. There's the Sky Chapel. Come down to the temple someday and take a tour of it. There are tours every day except Monday, so please feel free to stop in and see the Sky Chapel. Pardon me. Let me just finish with two quick slides here. So remember I said that the church leaders in the 1850s wanted an office building, thinking that they could rent space, make some money, and turn that money around to other Methodist churches. Believe it or not, it's exactly what they did. And you'll see that in 1860, there were 7 Methodist churches in Chicago. In 1920, there were 90. And almost every single one of those 90 churches got money from the first church downtown. And that includes this church. When it was a church, the Irving Park Methodist Church got money from the first church downtown. That money was used to help fledgling churches buy property or begin the process of building new buildings. Now today you can see the number of Methodist churches has shrunk. We now have just a few more than 50 in the entire city of Chicago. But in 1920 we had 90 Methodist churches. And we have the symbol that you may have seen for the United Methodist Church today. And let me just quickly say, when we say the United Methodist Church, that's a name for the church that dates to the year 1968, when the Methodist Church merged with the Evangelical United Brethren Church, EUB, you may know it as. But that merger took place in 1968, and so we have been the United Methodist Church ever since. Okay, now I just want to briefly say the inset of me up there is covering the name of the church we have illustrated here. But this is a church located on the south side of Chicago, Gresham United Methodist Church. It too received money from the church downtown. And to give you a sense of the connectionalism of Methodism, the man in the upper photograph here is the Reverend Martin Deppy. He served the Gresham Church in the 1960s. But in the 1990s, guess what? He was appointed here and was the pastor at this church from 1990 to 1999. He was very instrumental in doing some remodeling of the upstairs area as the church became the headquarters of the Reconciling Ministries program. Reconciling Congregation Program, as it was called in those days. So this is an example of another church besides this one, when we were a church, that received money from the church downtown. So I'm going to let Vicci, and Vicci, I've taken a lot of your time, so forgive me, but I'll let Vicci say a few words about our building where we are right now.
Thank you, David. I am not the historian that David is. So I really appreciate that he was able to provide so much of the real detail that I think it's news to even some of us who are lifelong Methodists. But his transition to Martin Deppy from the 60s, being very involved in really the civil rights movement in Chicago, it reinforces he really was one of the few white pastors on the south side of Chicago. And he was specifically asked to go down and be part of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. So then, in the 90s, he was asked to come here. So when David was talking about the fact that pastors are moved around within the Methodist Church to where they're needed, this was where he was needed in the 90s. So for those of us who are here and have been part of this church, the history of not only Methodism, but the history of what happens within a building, within a place, and within the people that come together, whether it be in that building or in another place as they move on, is very, very important. And I think it dates back to Wesley and bringing people together in small groups, on the streets, wherever we were, we come together. Whatever our faith is, we come together in love. And I think that's what we have here today. So I'd like to give you just a little bit of a history as to why this happened here. So the little wooden church that you see was right here in this space. Prior to that, it was a group of people who got together, decided they wanted to form a church, and then they eventually, in a few years, they built that little wooden church. So that's right there. Those are the streets out front, and they're actually, they're a lot of dirt, but a little bit of wood as well. Then they decided that this whole area was growing. So this whole area was growing rather substantially in the early 1900s. So they decided to build what they called the chapel. We kind of, I think David also called it the education building. So that would be the building that's over here, okay, as you go. If you don't, you go through the church and you can have a tour later, but it's like the back part of this building. And they did it because they had to house all of the children and all the people that were coming to church here. So they dedicated that building in 1908. Well, growth continued. So they built onto that building. And that's part of what we're sitting in today. So I should do this. So the congregation back then had 390 adults and over 550 children in Sunday school. And that was very true of these neighborhoods right here, Avondale, Irving Park, Portage Park. Everybody was together. They were just growing. These were farmers, farmlands. Everybody went to church. That's the fellowship hall downstairs. During the war, churches were very connected to the people who were fighting for our country, fighting for world peace. And we used to have a very large display in this church of all the service men and women. These newsletters and these connections were very, very important part of the communication, not only for the people who were here, but for their loved ones who were serving overseas. This is actually a sketch of what they were perceiving would be this new part of the chapel. And I want to point this out because the next picture here, see if I can find my little pointer. So this is actually what was established earlier. So you can see the way that the pews and everything, they're kind of diagonal this way. So you would have entered the back of the sanctuary, you would have been looking that way. And actually, this whole wall, this part of the wall was open. So if you were to go to the third floor of the building, expanded to the east here, that ceiling that you see there is the original chapel. So the wood that you see in there is part of that original building. But this was open, and this was the way that this sanctuary faced. Now, they continued to grow. So in the 1960s, they expanded again. And then when they expanded and they turned the entire sanctuary this way, the way that you see it now. And they paid off their mortgage, and they had pews that were full. Then the city of Chicago decided to put in the Kennedy Expressway. And when they put in the Kennedy Expressway, it cut through all of these neighborhoods. It separated the neighborhoods, Avondale, Irving Park. People they went to the suburbs. Things changed dramatically. So it wasn't just this church that saw their numbers go down. It was churches throughout this whole area, and a lot of it had to do with the building of the expressway and separating these neighborhoods that used to walk to church. They used to be an active part of the neighborhood. So this building, as you see it now, has been here for a long time. And the towers that you see over there used to be where the Sunday school kids would be. The towers that are on the Keeler side, those were the Sunday school towers. So the kids would go up and down. And I will say my children grew up here in this church, and they know where all the tunnels and all the secret passageways are. So there are a lot of little things to see. Other things that happened as part of Methodism here on this corner, and Methodism working with other faith communities, was the creation of the Irving Park Community Food Pantry, which to this day is one of the most successful food pantries in the city of Chicago. And when this building was sold, the pantry moved to another Methodist church, but I'm so happy to say that the Irving Park Food Pantry that was started by this tiny woman, and she was tiny. Her name was Leila Duncan. She saw people in need, people that were hungry on the street, and she started taking her grocery bags and filling them up, and not only walking, but taking the bus to find the people that were hungry in the city. That passion that tiny woman had grew into the Irving Park Community Food Pantry as churches throughout this area came together here in this building, in the basement of this building, to operate for basically until 2018 from this building. So in the holidays, whatever, these pews were always full with people that were coming, waiting for food. And so I'm very excited to say that Phil Sheets, who is right here, he's a retired pastor. he came back for celebrating the 40-year anniversary of the pantry. He was instrumental in its founding as well. And John Saris is still the director of the pantry, but right now they have over $2 million in grants. And they're going to be building a new building on Pulaski. And they're going to be they're going to continue to serve the people in need through a new building, through the growth that's come from starting here and reaching out to the neighborhoods and working with other churches and working with other faith communities. So I think Leila would be very happy, and I know that those of us who grew up here in this church watching the pantry go, we're all very excited. And we had this, up here in this corner, we had Mission Hispana. Many different ministries actually worshiped here in this church. And it's very, very much like what you're opening your doors to all faith communities. This was Mission Hispana, and this is the pastor that came who was very passionate, had her congregations meet here, and we came together on so many fronts. This is the upstairs. So this is the what you now has as your world religion. Like this, the temple up there, and so this is the way that this was reconstructed in the 90s to basically house Reconciling Ministries, which is a international organization, but also Sunday school classes, and we're so excited that it's still being used in such a beautiful way today. And then down here, we would have lots of Bible study groups. This is actually me and my daughter, who's now 29, but that was actually in the room that is over here, outside this door, that has been completely transformed as well. And then down in the bottom, I wanted to say, our children did grow up here singing. There's a tremendous amount of outreach that's taken place from this space. So in November of 2019, and that's David right there carrying our Bible, and Kathy's here today. This is Kathy, she's here today. We said goodbye, in a way, to this building, and it was after great, I think, well, there were just a lot of meetings, let's put it that way. But we really didn't want to sell the building to someone that was going to tear it down. And we wanted to see this space and the outreach and the work that had been happening here on the corner of Grace and Keeler for so long continue. And we were very, very blessed to see what's happening here today transform. I'm kind of emotional. And this is Swami's not able to be with us today, but he's almost always here every time I come, and welcomes me to come back whenever. So that was the day that we turned over the keys and a few other things, and the transformation became. So some beautiful new life and outreach is happening here, and I personally am saying thank you. This is where we are now. We're in a church building that's up in Albany Park. So again, this is how faith continues. You find your new space, you find your new neighborhoods, you find your new calling. And this is where we are up in Albany Park. And I'd like to close. We found a quilt that was in a box that came from this building somewhere, that came from the conference somewhere. And it is full of patchwork from churches all over the country. And we saved that quilt, and it's now in a museum, but we felt called to tell stories. That quilt was telling stories, and we felt that that's part of what our calling is, to continue the storytelling. So that's why that quilt is there. And this is a more contemporary building, but it was completely destroyed by fire and water, and we had to pretty much restructure that whole building as well. So that's the Albany Park Ministry Center, and I want to point out that we share this space with First Vietnamese. So again, it's communities coming together to find what their calling is. And so the name of the church, we joined with another United Methodist church from Lincoln Square called Barry United Methodist Church to create Renewed Hope. And as part of Renewed Hope, one of our major missions is the Irving Park Community Food Pantry. So I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and if you have any questions, we'll be happy to take them. And then I know, yes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for delivering the history of United Methodist Church. I have few questions. Number one is that why it is called Methodist? Is it some kind of methodology is developed for the churches, or some other reason, just the name? The second question is it United Methodist? Is it different from Southern Methodist, which the southern part of this country, they claim they are Southern Methodist? The United and the Southern Methodist, are these two different denominations or the same?
Very good questions, thank you. Why are we called Methodists to begin with? Well, very briefly, when John Wesley was a student at Oxford in the early years of the 18th century, he found that his brother Charles was involved in a small group of other very religiously earnest students who would get together every week to pray, to read scripture, and then to go out to the prisons and speak to prisoners and so on. Well, they were very methodical about their scheduling of events. They met at a certain hour every single day. They allocated a certain amount of time to prayer. Then they allocated more time to visiting the sick and so on. Well, their colleagues at school, the other students, you can imagine what the other students thought of them, and they came up with a lot of not so nice names to describe these very earnest folks who were reading their Bible every day and praying and so on. And one of those names was Methodist because, yes, it means methodical. They were very methodical about what they did, but it was a term of derision. It was not a compliment. It was really meant to belittle them. And Wesley himself didn't really like it, but pretty much he decided, it's not a bad word to use for who we are. And the name has stuck, and we have been the Methodist Church ever since. So, okay, I didn't say anything about this in my talk. It's a big subject, but in 1844, there was one Methodist church in the United States, the Methodist Episcopal Church. But in 1844, the southern states pulled out because there were issues involving slavery. The Methodist Church very much reflected the political tensions of the United States in those days. Those tensions especially over slavery, and of course we know those tensions eventually erupted into the American Civil War in the 1860s. But in the 1840s, the Methodists had their own Civil War, and the Northerners said, you can't be a Methodist and own slaves. And the Southerners said, well, maybe we can. Well, they couldn't compromise, and so the Southern Methodists really pulled out of the Methodist Church and created their own church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Honestly, that was the name of the church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And in 1939, well after the American Civil War, those two churches, the North and the South, were able to get together and reunify. And so from 1939 on, there was one Methodist church again in the United States, one major Methodist church in the United States. Now, you know that the church has split again just a few years ago over other social issues, and a lot of the churches that pulled out of the United Methodist Church were Southern churches again, but certainly by no means entirely Southern churches. They were really from every part of the United States. But a number of Methodist churches have pulled out again and joined other Methodist bodies. The major one is called the Global Methodist Church, I believe. but the United Methodist Church remains the same church that we've always been since 1784 in the United States. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. At least now I know the reason for the word methodology, Methodist. I was in Mobile, Alabama for many years. The Southern Methodists made very bad comments about Hinduism years after years after years. And still probably they make comments, basically denouncing this religion and also what we do or not. I mean, so frustrating of their comments that came to in Mobile Register almost every year during the Hindu festivals. So, I mean, it is very hard to have faith or respect that kind of comments when somebody makes of other religions. But now I understand that the United is different from.
I'm not sure I understood everything that you said, but I would say that Methodism in the southern part of the United States may appear different than Methodism in other parts of the United States. If you worship at a church in either part of the country, the worship may seem the same, but there are definitely cultural differences that we still see to this day, regional differences here in the United States. And southern churches probably are more conservative than northern churches. That's not totally true in every case, but I would say you probably see more. What I think I would say is that a lot of Methodist churches in the South may seem more like Baptist churches, Southern Baptist churches, but that you wouldn't see that in the North particularly.
I have two questions. The first is, was there much contact or influence between Wesley and the other Protestant movements and even Presbyterianism, Lutheranism, and so on?
I think I would say no. The truth is, the revival movement that Wesley spearheaded began under the preaching of a man named George Whitefield, who was also a free spirit. And he was Church of England as well, but he was very Calvinistic in his theology, and John Wesley was not, so they eventually parted company. Wesley was very much influenced by a group of Christians known as Moravians. You may know Moravia as a region of what we today call the Czech Republic, but there was a Protestant group known as the Moravian United Brethren, or let's just call them Moravians. And Wesley was heavily influenced by them and spent a lot of time with the Moravians. He eventually parted company with them too. How close he was with Presbyterians, I don't know. I cannot answer that, but I think Wesley's movement was fairly much on its own. He certainly considered himself to be open to a lot of faiths and working with a lot of people, but I think in those days, denominations stuck to themselves maybe more closely than we do today. I don't know.
My second question, I'm from Canada. The Methodist Church seems to have disappeared in Canada. It merged with a branch of Presbyterianism to form the United Church of Canada. What's that all about?
Well, you'll have to forgive me, I can't really speak to the United Church of Canada, but yes, the Methodist churches, or I assume most of them, did become a part of the United Church of Canada. And that, by the way, I think also happened in India. There's a Church of South India and a Church of North India that is a combination of a number of Protestant churches in India. So how the Methodist identity continues to express itself in Canada or India, I cannot say. I don't know. I really don't know. But yes, there are some places in the world where Methodism has merged with other Protestant bodies in a larger church.
Yeah, actually, I have one question about slavery, actually. You said that somebody said that this church worked in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. But when Methodist movement started in 1700s, what was their stand on slavery?
Okay, now I can't answer that question. John Wesley was very much opposed to slavery, and some of his most dramatic works involve his criticism of slavery and as it existed in the United States. You may not know, but Wesley actually spent 2 years of his life in the colony of Georgia from 1735 to 1737 or so. So he did see slavery firsthand, and he was very much opposed to it. And when the Methodist Episcopal Church was organized in 1784 in the United States, there were places where white Methodists and black Methodists worshiped together with not too much difficulty. But as the slavery issue became more important in the United States in the 1800s and racial divisions hardened, black Methodists pulled out of the Methodist Church and created their own. So, for instance, you've heard of the AME Church. It's the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and there is also an AME Zion Church. They were formed by black Methodists who felt like they were second-class citizens in the way Methodism was developing in the 1800s in the United States. But that's not the case when Wesley himself was alive. Wesley was really very liberal in this area, and we can look to that and feel good about it, but as the church developed in this country in the 1800s, the issues around slavery and racial equality caused a lot of trouble in the church, and was indeed the reason for the big split between the Northern Church and the Southern Church in 1844.
Thank you.